The lawyer's briefcase gleamed like a weapon in my morning light. Behind him stood my new daughter-in-law, Rachel, wearing a smile that never reached her eyes and a desperation she thought I couldn't see. But after 70 years, on this earth, you learn to read the spaces between words, the tremor behind practiced charm. "We just want to protect you, Mom," Rachel said, stepping into my kitchen uninvited, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I was sitting on $47 million. Money my late husband Thomas had hidden so carefully that even I had only discovered it 3 weeks after his funeral, locked away in a safe behind our basement water heater, along with a letter that began, "Margaret, if you're reading this, the wolves are already at the door." My name is Margaret Chen Williams. I am 70 years old, a widow, and I live in the quiet hills of Asheville, North Carolina. For most of my adult life, I balanced books at a family-owned hardware store and thought the hardest chapter of my story ended when I buried my husband. I was wrong. The real test began exactly 7 days after my son's wedding, when I opened my front door to find Rachel and a stranger with legal documents that would strip away everything Thomas had spent decades protecting. But let me start at the beginning, because this story isn't just about money. It's about the moment a quiet woman discovers that silence can be the most powerful weapon of all. My name is Margaret Chen Williams, and I have lived in the same house in Asheville for 43 years. The blue Victorian sits on Elm Street like a patient grandmother, weathered but dignified, with a wraparound porch that Thomas built with his own hands the summer after we married. Thomas was a carpenter by trade, a philosopher by nature. He believed in measuring twice and cutting once, in saving every nail and screw, in the kind of thrift that people mistake for poverty, but is actually a form of faith. Faith that a life built slowly with care can weather any storm. We met at the hardware store where I kept the books. He came in looking for wood stain and left with my phone number written on the back of a receipt. Our courtship was conducted in lumber aisles and over coffee that grew cold while we talked about everything and nothing. He proposed beside a display of garden tools, holding a ring he'd bought with money saved from fixing neighbors' porches. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady as his hands, "I can't promise you riches, but I can promise you a life built to last." He kept that promise for 42 years. The hardware store became my second home. I arrived each morning at 7:30, hung my sweater on the same hook, and settled into the rhythm of receivables and inventory. Numbers have always made sense to me. They don't lie, don't flatter, don't pretend to be something they're not. In a world of variable emotions, a balanced ledger felt like solid ground. Thomas worked construction during the day and woodworking projects at night. Our garage became his workshop, filled with the smell of sawdust and the patient sounds of a man who believed every piece of wood had a purpose. He made our kitchen table, our bedroom dresser, the bookshelves that still line our living room, each piece marked with his careful attention to grain and joint, built to outlast the hands that shaped it. We lived below our means not because we had to, but because we chose to. While neighbors bought bigger houses and newer cars, we planted a garden, preserved tomatoes, and found wealth in small rituals. Sunday morning pancakes, evening walks around the neighborhood, Thomas reading aloud from the newspaper while I mended clothes. People called it simple. We called it rich. Our son Michael was born on a snowy February morning when the power was out, and Thomas drove me to the hospital by the light of street lamps. Michael had his father's steady hands and my stubborn streak. Thomas taught him to use tools before he could tie his shoes, and I taught him that every penny earned deserved respect. Michael was our miracle and our joy. He built tree houses with Thomas, helped me plant the spring garden, and filled our quiet house with the chaos that only children can bring. When he graduated high school, we were the parents in the bleachers cheering loud enough to embarrass him. When he left for college, the house echoed for months. Thomas never earned a fortune by anyone's standards but his own. He fixed what was broken, built what was needed, and saved what others might have spent. "Waste is disrespect," he'd say, carefully straightening used nails for the coffee can collection. "Everything has value if you look close enough." What I didn't know, couldn't have imagined, was that Thomas had been looking very closely indeed. The cancer came quietly, the way Thomas did most things. By the time we caught it, it had settled in like an unwelcome tenant with no plans to leave. The treatments bought us 18 months. 18 months of small victories and gentle defeats, of morning coffee shared in careful silence, and nights when I listened to his breathing like a lullaby I was afraid would end. On his last lucid day, while snow fell outside the hospice window, Thomas pressed a brass key into my palm. His fingers were thin, his voice barely a whisper, but his eyes burned with the intensity of a man who had one last secret to share. "Margaret," he said, squeezing my hand with what strength remained, "there's something you need to know. But not yet. Wait until you need it. Wait until someone tries to take advantage of your grief. Promise me." I promised, though I didn't understand. I held that key like a talisman through the funeral, through the casseroles and sympathy cards, through the long afternoons when the house felt too big and too quiet. I kept it in the drawer of my bedside table next to the love letters he'd written during our brief engagement, waiting for the moment when I would need whatever secret it unlocked. That moment came exactly 7 days after our son's wedding, when Rachel showed up at my door with a lawyer and a folder full of documents designed to strip away my independence under the guise of protection. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about the wedding first, because that's where I first understood what my future would look like if I didn't find the courage to fight for it. The wedding was everything Rachel had dreamed of and everything I had dreaded. Trinity Episcopal Church was transformed into a shrine of white roses and gold ribbon, with enough candles to illuminate a small city. The guest list topped 200, and the reception hall looked like something from a magazine, the kind of magazine I'd never thought to buy. I arrived early wearing my navy dress and the pearl necklace Thomas had given me for our 25th anniversary. A young man in a black suit checked his clipboard and guided me through the reception hall to a round table in the far corner, behind a marble pillar and an arrangement of white lilies that reached toward the ceiling like a pale tree. "Table 19, he announced, checking my place card against his list. I sat down and realized immediately that the pillar and the flowers created a perfect wall. From my seat, I could see a narrow slice of the head table if I leaned far to the left, and the edge of the dance floor if I craned my neck to the right. Between those angles, there was nothing but white petals and shadows. "Oh, you must be Michael's mother," said a woman sliding into the seat beside me. She wore pearls the size of grapes and a smile that suggested she was doing me a favor by speaking. "I'm Rachel's great-aunt Patricia." "Isn't this just magical?" I nodded and straightened my napkin, understanding my place in this particular magic show. I was the prop that proved family mattered, positioned precisely where I couldn't interfere with the carefully choreographed perfection. Across the room, Rachel's mother, Beverly, held court at table 2, accepting compliments on the flowers and the music with gracious nods. She wore champagne silk and the bearing of a woman who knew how to make an entrance. When photographers approached, she turned at just the right angle, smiled at just the right wattage. I watched the wedding from behind my floral barrier like a passenger on a train, catching glimpses of a journey I wasn't really part of. The processional music began, and Rachel appeared at the far end of the aisle in a dress that cost more than I'd spent on clothes in the last 5 years. She was beautiful, I'll give her that. Luminous in the way that youth and silk and professional photography can make anyone luminous. Michael waited at the altar in a rented tuxedo, his face a mixture of pride and panic that I recognized from the day he'd learned to drive. When Rachel reached him, he took her hands like he was catching something precious that might slip away. The vows floated around my pillar in fragments, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. as long as we both shall live. I thought of Thomas and me reciting those same words 42 years earlier in a ceremony that cost less than this reception's flower budget, and felt the weight of promises that had held through ordinary years and extraordinary losses. During the cocktail hour, I remained at my table while guests circulated with drinks that looked like jewelry. Michael appeared briefly, kissed my forehead, and promised to come back after the toasts. He looked handsome and nervous and young, so young that I wanted to smooth his hair the way I had when he was 7. "Thanks for being here, Mom," he said, the words falling like coins into a slot. Correct, efficient, already counting the cost of sentiment. "You look wonderful, sweetheart," I replied, choosing blessing over burden. The dinner toasts began with Beverly raising her champagne flute to share a story about Rachel rescuing a stray dog in college. The room responded with appropriate laughter and tears. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it brief. A few words about Michael's first toolbox and the day he learned to measure twice, cut once. I lifted my glass and sat down before anyone could decide how they felt about the quiet mother in the corner. As the dancing began, I remained in my chair and watched the celebration spin around me like a carousel I'd never been invited to ride. The music rose and fell, couples swayed and laughed, and I counted the beats like a metronome marking time in a song I couldn't quite hear. I didn't leave early. I didn't make a scene. I sat in my assigned seat until the last song played, holding my small portion of joy like a candle in a storm. When Michael found me as the evening wound down, I told him I'd had a wonderful time and that I was proud of him. Both statements were true, in their way. But as I drove home through the empty streets of Asheville, past the hardware store where I'd spent so many years balancing other people's numbers, I felt something shift inside my chest. A door I hadn't known was there swung quietly shut, and I understood with crystalline clarity that my place in my son's new life would be exactly what it had been tonight, present enough to count, distant enough not to matter. I parked in my driveway and sat for a moment looking at the house Thomas and I had built together. The porch light cast a warm circle on the steps where we'd shared morning coffee and evening conversations. Inside, his reading chair still held the shape of his body, and his coffee cup still sat in the sink where I couldn't bring myself to wash it. That's when I remembered the brass key in my bedside drawer and Thomas's words, "Wait until someone tries to take advantage of your grief." I didn't know it yet, but that moment was less than a week away. Thomas gave me the key on a Wednesday night in February, 3 days before he died. The hospice room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines and the whisper of snow against the window. His hand, thin and cold, pressed the brass key into my palm with more strength than I'd felt from him in weeks. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely audible, "this opens something you'll need when the time comes. Not now, you're not ready now, but when someone tries to convince you that you can't take care of yourself, when they come with papers and promises, then you'll be ready." I closed my fingers around the metal, feeling its weight and warmth from his body. "What does it open, Thomas?" "Our future," he whispered. "The one I built for you when I couldn't be here to protect you myself." Those were almost the last words he spoke to me. He died the following Saturday morning while I held his hand and hummed the Patsy Cline song he'd always loved. After the funeral, after the sympathy casseroles had been eaten and the thank you cards written, I found myself alone in the house that suddenly felt cavernous. I'd put the key in my jewelry box next to my wedding ring and tried to forget about it. Thomas had always been practical about everything. I assumed this was just another of his careful preparations, maybe a safe deposit box or an emergency fund. I was completely unprepared for what I found. The morning after Michael's wedding, as I sat at my kitchen table replaying the previous night's careful choreography of exclusion, I remembered Thomas's words with new clarity. "When someone tries to convince you that you can't take care of yourself." I retrieved the key from my jewelry box and made my way to the basement, a space that had been Thomas's domain. It smelled of sawdust and machine oil, filled with the neat rows of tools and wood scraps that he'd organized with military precision. I'd avoided it since his death. Too many memories of him working late into the night on projects that filled our house with the patient sounds of creation. Behind his workbench, hidden by a pegboard of carefully arranged tools, I found a small panel in the wall that I'd never noticed before. The key fit perfectly into a lock I'd never seen. Inside was a fireproof safe, and inside that safe was everything that would change my life. The first thing I saw was a letter in Thomas's careful handwriting, the same script that had labeled every coffee can in his workshop and every folder in our filing cabinet. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then someone has come to you with papers and promises, trying to convince you that you need protection. They're right about one thing. You do need protection, but not from your own competence. You need protection from them. What I'm about to tell you will shock you, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for keeping secrets, and I'm sorry for not preparing you better. But I'm not sorry for what I built for us. Over the past 20 years, I haven't just been fixing porches and building cabinets. I've been investing, quietly, carefully, every extra dollar we saved, every bonus from a big job, every inheritance from your Aunt Lillian that you thought went into the house repairs, it all went somewhere safer. Margaret, you are worth $47 million. I had to read that sentence 3 times before my brain would accept it. $47 million, more money than I'd ever imagined, hidden away while we clipped coupons and drove our car until the transmission finally surrendered. The letter continued. I know you're angry right now, and you have every right to be. But before you decide I was a fool or a miser, let me explain. I grew up poor, Margaret. Poorer than you ever knew. I grew up watching my father work 3 jobs while my mother cleaned houses, and I watched them lose everything anyway when my father got sick, and the medical bills ate through their savings like termites through good wood. I swore that would never happen to us. I swore that if anything happened to me, you would never have to depend on anyone's charity or kindness or promises. You would never have to sign papers you didn't understand or give up control of your life because you couldn't afford to keep it. The money is in an irrevocable trust with your name on it. I've worked with lawyers you've never met, in a city you've never been to make sure that no one, not Michael, not his wife, not anyone, can touch it without your explicit consent. The trust is structured so that if anyone tries to gain power of attorney over you without clear medical evidence of incapacity, the assets become completely untouchable. I built you a fortress, Margaret. You just have to have the courage to live in it. My hands were shaking by the time I finished reading. I sat on Thomas's old work stool, surrounded by his tools and his careful order, and tried to process what he'd done. Not just the money, though that was staggering enough, but the planning. The years of secrets and careful investments and legal maneuvering, all done to protect me from a future he'd seen coming, even when I couldn't. The safe contained folders of investment statements, legal documents, and contact information for attorneys I'd never heard of. There were spreadsheets in Thomas's neat handwriting showing how he'd built our fortune, a little in tech stocks in the 90s, some in real estate before the boom, careful diversification that had weathered every market storm of the past 2 decades. At the bottom of the safe was another envelope marked "For Michael" in Thomas's writing. Inside was a letter and a check for $50,000, enough to clear the wedding debt I suspected he and Rachel had accumulated, but not enough to solve their bigger problems permanently. Michael, the letter began, by now you know about your mother's inheritance. This money is for you and Rachel to start your marriage debt-free. But understand this, your mother's fortune is hers alone. I built it for her protection, not for your comfort. If you love her, you'll protect her independence. If you don't, you'll reveal your true character. The choice is yours. I sat in the basement for 2 hours, reading and rereading every document, trying to reconcile the man who'd saved every screw in coffee cans with the man who'd quietly accumulated more wealth than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Finally, I understood. They were the same man. The same careful attention to detail, the same stubborn refusal to waste anything of value, the same quiet determination to protect what mattered most. I locked everything back in the safe and climbed the stairs to a house that looked exactly the same but felt completely different. I was still Margaret Chen Williams, 70-year-old widow from Asheville, but now I was also something else, a woman with choices. That night, I called the law firm whose card Thomas had left on top of the stack. A woman named Sarah Martinez answered, and when I gave her the code phrase Thomas had written in his letter, her voice immediately warmed. "Mrs. Chen Williams," she said, "we've been waiting for your call. Your husband was very specific about when you might need us. How can we help?" I told her about Rachel and the lawyer, about the folder of documents they wanted me to sign. She listened without interruption, then spoke with the kind of quiet authority that I recognized from years of balancing books. "Mrs. Chen Williams, you don't need to sign anything. In fact, I strongly advise you not to. Your husband built protections that are much stronger than anything they could offer you. But first, we need to meet. Can you come to Charlotte tomorrow?" I could, and I did. And that meeting changed everything. The law offices of Martinez, Chen, and Associates occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in downtown Charlotte, 2 hours south of Asheville. I'd never been in a building so tall, had never needed lawyers more sophisticated than the man who'd helped us buy our house 30 years earlier. Sarah Martinez was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes and a handshake that suggested she'd learned to be firm in a world that expected women to be soft. Her corner office looked out over the city, and she offered me coffee from a machine that probably cost more than my first car. "Your husband was remarkable," she said, settling behind a desk covered with neat stacks of documents. "In 25 years of practice, I've never seen anyone plan so thoroughly for their spouse's protection." She opened a file that looked thick enough to contain a novel. "Let me explain what he built for you." For the next 3 hours, Sarah walked me through the labyrinth of trusts, accounts, and legal protections that Thomas had constructed. The irrevocable trust meant that the money belonged to me, but couldn't be touched by creditors, ex-spouses, or anyone seeking to claim it through legal manipulation. The trust was managed by a board of 3 trustees, all of them financial professionals with no personal connection to my family. "If someone tries to gain power of attorney over you," Sarah explained, "the trust immediately goes into protective mode. The assets become completely inaccessible until you personally, in the presence of independent medical and legal counsel, confirm that you want them involved in your financial decisions." She pulled out another document. "Your husband also established something called a predator fund. Money specifically set aside to fight anyone who tries to take advantage of you legally. If someone sues you or tries to manipulate you through the courts, this fund ensures you have unlimited resources to defend yourself." I thought of Rachel's desperate smile and the lawyer's confident assumption that I would sign whatever they placed in front of me. "Thomas saw this coming?" "He saw it as a possibility," Sarah said gently. "Wealthy widows are common targets for financial exploitation, and it often comes from within families. Your husband wanted to make sure you never had to choose between your independence and your relationships." We spent another hour reviewing my options. Sarah recommended a local attorney in Asheville named David Kim, someone who could handle day-to-day issues without the expense of a Charlotte firm. She also gave me a small card to keep in my wallet with a phone number that would connect me to emergency legal assistance 24 hours a day. "One more thing," she said as I prepared to leave. "Your husband left specific instructions about disclosure. You are under no obligation to tell anyone about your financial situation. Not your son, not his wife, not anyone. The trust will continue to generate income, whether people know about it or not. But surely Michael should know. That's your choice entirely, Sarah said. But your husband believed that knowledge of wealth often changes relationships in unpredictable ways. He wanted you to have time to adjust to your new circumstances before making decisions about sharing that information. I drove home to Asheville in a daze, my head spinning with trust documents and investment statements and the stunning reality that I would never again have to worry about money. But more than that, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Thomas died. Power. Not power over other people, but power over my own life. The power to say no without explanation, to make choices without justification, to live according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. When I reached home, I found a message on my answering machine from Rachel, her voice bright with artificial cheer. "Hi, Mom Margaret. Just calling to see how you're feeling after the big day. We're thinking about stopping by tomorrow with something we'd love to run by you. Nothing urgent, just some paperwork that might make your life a little easier. See you soon." I played the message 3 times, hearing the subtext more clearly each time. They were coming, just as Thomas had predicted, but now I was ready for them. I spent the evening organizing my thoughts and my documents. I put Sarah Martinez's card in my wallet and David Kim's number in my phone. I read through the trust documents one more time, marveling at the complexity of the legal fortress Thomas had built around me. Then I wrote a letter to Michael, not to send, but to clarify my own thoughts. Dear Michael, tomorrow your wife will come to my door with a lawyer and a folder full of documents designed to strip away my independence. She'll tell me it's for my own protection, that I'm too old and confused to manage my own affairs. What she doesn't know is that your father spent 20 years preparing for exactly this moment. I am not helpless and I am not confused. I am a wealthy woman with more legal protection than she could imagine. But I'm also your mother, and that makes this harder than any mere financial transaction. I love you, Michael. I will always love you. But I will not sacrifice my autonomy to make your marriage easier. If you want to be my son, you'll stand beside me tomorrow when they try to convince me to sign away my freedom. If you want to be her husband more than my son, that's your choice, but you can't be both. Either way, I'll survive. Your father made sure of that. Love. Mom. I folded the letter and put it in Thomas's safe with the other documents that told the story of our hidden life. Then I made myself a cup of tea and sat on the porch Thomas had built, watching the lights of Asheville twinkle in the valley below. Tomorrow would bring the test Thomas had prepared me for. But tonight I was just a widow sitting on her own porch, protected by the love of a man who'd known how to measure twice and cut once, even when the measurement was the rest of my life. They came on a Tuesday morning while I was deadheading the roses Thomas had planted the year before he died. I saw the silver sedan pull into my driveway and recognized Rachel's platinum hair through the windshield. Beside her sat a man in a dark suit carrying a leather briefcase that caught the morning sun like a shield. I set down my pruning shears and watched them approach my front door with the careful choreography of people who'd rehearsed this moment. Rachel wore cream-colored slacks and a silk blouse that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Her companion looked like every lawyer in every movie, distinguished, confident, and slightly bored by the routine nature of manipulating elderly women. I let them knock twice before answering, using the time to center myself in the knowledge that Thomas had given me. When I opened the door, Rachel's smile was so bright it could have powered the house. "Mom Margaret, I hope we're not catching you at a bad time. This is Andrew Wellington. He's a family law attorney who specializes in elder care planning. We thought it might be helpful for you to hear about some options that could make your life simpler." Andrew stepped forward with a business card and a handshake that lingered just a beat too long. "Mrs. Chen Williams, what a pleasure." Rachel has told me so much about you. I have to say, you have a beautiful home here. I thanked him and led them into my living room, the space where Thomas and I had shared 40 years of quiet evenings. Rachel perched on the edge of the sofa like a bird ready to take flight, while Andrew settled into Thomas's reading chair with the casual ease of a man who believed he belonged wherever he happened to be. "Can I offer you coffee?" I asked, falling back on the manners that had carried me through decades of uncomfortable situations. "That would be lovely," Rachel said, though she made no move to help. Andrew nodded and immediately began removing documents from his briefcase. In the kitchen, I took my time with the coffee, listening to their low conversation from the living room. I heard phrases like cognitive decline and asset protection and family harmony. When I returned with a tray, Andrew had arranged several documents on my coffee table like a dealer laying out cards. "Mrs. Chen Williams," he began, his voice warm with practiced sympathy. "I understand you've been through a tremendous loss with Thomas's passing. Grief can make even simple decisions feel overwhelming, which is why so many families find it helpful to put protective measures in place during difficult transitions." He gestured to the papers with a gold pen that probably cost more than my monthly electric bill. "What we have here are standard documents that would allow Michael and Rachel to assist you with financial and medical decisions should the need arise. It's really just a safety net. No one hopes you'll ever need it, but if something were to happen, these documents would ensure that people who love you could step in and help." I sipped my coffee and studied the top document. Durable Power of Attorney was printed across the header in bold letters, followed by several pages of dense legal text. "This seems quite comprehensive," I said. "How long have you been practicing elder law, Mr. Wellington?" 15 years, he replied smoothly. "I've helped hundreds of families navigate these kinds of transitions. The key is to put protections in place while you're healthy and thinking clearly, rather than waiting for a crisis." Rachel leaned forward, her hands clasped like she was praying. "Mom, Margaret, we just want to make sure you're taken care of. Michael worries about you being alone in this big house, especially after what happened to your neighbor last month." I thought about Mrs. Patterson, who'd fallen and broken her hip, and who'd been discovered 12 hours later by her mail carrier. It was a legitimate concern, the kind of story that made children nervous about their aging parents. "I appreciate the concern," I said, "but I'm curious about the scope of these documents. It looks like this power of attorney would give you authority over all of my financial decisions." Andrew nodded enthusiastically. "That's what makes it so effective. Rather than having to get court approval for every transaction, Michael would be able to handle everything from paying bills to making investment decisions. It streamlines the whole process." "And what safeguards exist to prevent misuse?" For the first time, Andrew's smile flickered. "Well, the document itself specifies that the agent, in this case Michael, must act in your best interests. And of course, you'd retain the right to revoke the power of attorney at any time." "Assuming I'm competent to do so." "Of course," he said, though something in his tone suggested that competency might become a matter of interpretation. Rachel reached across the coffee table and touched my hand. "Mom, Margaret, we would never do anything to hurt you. You know that, right? Michael loves you so much, and I love you too. We just want to make sure you're protected." I looked at this young woman who'd married my son 6 days ago, who'd seated me behind a pillar at her wedding, who was now asking me to sign away my independence while claiming it was an act of love. I thought about the $47 million that she had no idea existed, and about Thomas's warning that someone would eventually come with papers and promises. "I'd like to have my attorney review these documents before I sign anything," I said. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Andrew's pen stopped moving, and Rachel's smile became more fixed. "Of course," Andrew said, though his tone suggested that my caution was unnecessary and slightly insulting. "Though I should mention that these are fairly standard documents." Most families find that involving multiple attorneys just complicates what should be a simple process. I'm sure that's true, I said, but I've always found it wise to seek second opinions on important decisions. I'll have my lawyer look everything over and get back to you. Rachel glanced at Andrew, then back at me. Mom, Margaret, you don't actually have a lawyer, do you? I mean, not for anything like this. I smiled and sipped my coffee. I do now. They left 15 minutes later, taking their documents and their disappointment with them. Andrew shook my hand again and assured me that he was available to answer any questions my attorney might have. Rachel hugged me at the door and told me she'd call in a few days to see how the review was going. After they left, I sat in my kitchen and called David Kim, the Asheville attorney Sarah Martinez had recommended. His office could see me that afternoon. I spent the rest of the morning in Thomas's basement workshop, surrounded by his tools and his careful order. I read his letter again, marveling at how precisely he'd predicted what would happen. He'd known that someone would come with documents and smiles, asking me to trust them with my future. But he'd also known that I was stronger than anyone gave me credit for, including myself. I'd spent 40 years balancing books and managing a household and raising a son. I'd nursed him through his final illness and buried him with grace. I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, with or without a $47 million trust fund to back me up. That afternoon, David Kim confirmed what I already knew. The documents Rachel and Andrew had brought were legal, but they were also dangerous. They would have given Michael unlimited authority over my finances and medical decisions, with virtually no oversight or accountability. In my experience, David said, people who push for immediate signatures on documents like these usually have reasons for being in a hurry. Good reasons or bad reasons, but reasons nonetheless. We spent 2 hours reviewing my options and establishing protective measures. David drafted a letter to Andrew Wellington, politely declining to sign the proposed documents and requesting that all future communications go through his office. He also helped me set up additional safeguards, advance directives that reflected my actual wishes, a limited power of attorney that would only activate if I was genuinely incapacitated, and a healthcare proxy that named my neighbor Clara as my primary advocate. You're in a strong position, David assured me as I prepared to leave his office. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. That evening, Michael called. His voice was strained, and I could hear Rachel in the background. Mom, Rachel said you want to have the documents reviewed by a lawyer. That's fine, of course, but she's worried that you might be overthinking this. These are really just standard protections. I'm sure they are, I said. But I've always believed in reading the fine print, Michael. It's served me well over the years. I know, but, well, Rachel thinks maybe you don't trust us. I paused, considering my words carefully. Michael, do you remember what your father used to say about measuring twice and cutting once? Of course. This is me measuring twice. If the documents are truly in my best interest, then a legal review will confirm that. If they're not... I let the sentence hang. He was quiet for a long moment. Okay, Mom. I guess that makes sense. How long do you think the review will take? As long as it takes, I said. Good decisions aren't rushed, sweetheart. After we hung up, I sat on Thomas's porch and watched the sun set over the mountains. I thought about the conversation I just had with my son, hearing the tension between his love for me and his loyalty to his new wife. I thought about the documents I'd refused to sign and the fortune I'd yet to reveal. Tomorrow, I would begin the delicate work of protecting myself without destroying my family. It was a narrow path to walk, but Thomas had given me a map. I just had to have the courage to follow it. The calls started the next morning and didn't stop for 3 days. First came Rachel, her voice bright with forced cheer. Just checking in on how the legal review is going. No rush, of course, but we're excited to get everything sorted out. Then Andrew Wellington, professional concern dripping through the phone. Mrs. Chen Williams, I wanted to follow up on our meeting. I've reviewed similar cases, and delays in establishing protective measures can sometimes complicate matters if an emergency arises. Then Michael, caught between two women who each believed they knew what was best for him. "Mom, is everything okay? Rachel's worried that maybe we offended you somehow. She just wants to help." Each call was a small test, a gentle probe to see if my resolve was weakening. I kept my responses polite but firm. The review was ongoing. I would be in touch when it was complete, and no, there was no emergency requiring immediate action. On the fourth day, they escalated. I was in my garden, transplanting the last of the fall mums, when I heard car doors slam in my driveway. This time it wasn't just Rachel and Andrew. Michael was with them, his face grim with the particular strain of a man being pulled in directions he couldn't reconcile. "Mom," he said before they'd even reached the porch, "we need to talk." I set down my trowel and brushed the soil from my hands. "Of course, sweetheart, come in." They arranged themselves in my living room like a tribunal. Rachel perched on the edge of the sofa. Andrew claimed Thomas's reading chair again, and Michael stood by the window like he was ready to flee at the first opportunity. "Mrs. Chen Williams," Andrew began, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I'm concerned that there may be some misunderstanding about the urgency of your situation." "What urgency?" I asked. He opened his briefcase and withdrew a different set of documents. "I've done some research into your financial situation, public records, you understand, and I'm afraid there are some potential vulnerabilities that need immediate attention." My blood went cold, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of vulnerabilities?" "Well, for instance, this house is still titled solely in your name. If something were to happen to you, a fall, a medical emergency, it could be tied up in probate for months or even years. That's money your family would need for your care." Rachel leaned forward, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Mom, Margaret, we're not trying to scare you, but Andrew's right. Look what happened to the Hendersons down the street. When Jim had his stroke, Karen couldn't access their accounts for weeks because everything was in his name only." Michael finally spoke from his position by the window. "Mom, I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. We're not trying to steal from you. We're trying to protect you." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged and whose fears I'd soothed, and saw a stranger wearing his face. Not a malicious stranger, but a weak one. A man who'd been convinced that love meant control, that protection required possession. "Michael," I said gently, "sit down. Please." He reluctantly took the chair across from me, avoiding my eyes like a child who knows he's been caught in a lie. "Tell me something," I continued. "When you were 8 years old and broke my favorite vase while playing baseball in the house, what did you do?" He looked confused by the question. I told you the truth. Eventually. But first, you tried to hide the pieces under your bed, didn't you? And when that didn't work, you tried to blame the cat. And only when you realized that none of your stories were working did you come to me crying and tell me what really happened. Mom, I don't see what that has to do with... You were afraid I'd be angry. You were afraid you'd be in trouble. So you tried every way you could think of to avoid facing the consequences of your actions. I looked at each of them in turn. The question is, what have you broken now that you're trying so hard to hide? The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel's face had gone pale, and Andrew was suddenly very interested in the documents in his lap. Michael cleared his throat. "Mom, we haven't broken anything. We're just trying to... To what? To gain access to bank accounts you think I'm too addled to manage? To control medical decisions I'm perfectly capable of making myself? To turn me into a dependent in my own home?" Andrew attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Mrs. Chen Williams, I think you're mischaracterizing our intentions. These documents are standard." "Stop." The word came out with more force than I'd intended, and all three of them froze. Mr. Wellington, I've had these documents reviewed by my attorney, as I told you I would. And do you know what he found? Andrew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He found that these standard documents would give my son unlimited access to all of my financial accounts, with no oversight, no reporting requirements, and no expiration date. He found that the medical power of attorney would allow decisions to be made about my care without my input, based solely on your assessment of my competency. I stood and walked to the window where Michael had been standing. He also found it interesting that you included language allowing for the sale of real property. This house, without my consent, should you deem it in my best interest. Rachel made a small sound that might have been a gasp or a sob. So here's what's going to happen, I continued, turning back to face them. Mr. Wellington, you're going to leave my home and you're not going to contact me again. If you have something to say to me, you can say it to my attorney. Andrew started to protest, but I held up a hand. Rachel, you're going to explain to me right now why you think you have the right to make decisions about my life, my money, and my property. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. Michael was worried. Michael is an adult who can speak for himself. I'm asking about you. The mask finally slipped. We thought the wedding was so expensive and my student loans and the house we want to buy. She dissolved into tears, the carefully maintained composure crumbling like tissue paper in rain. Michael moved to comfort her, but I held up a hand to stop him. And you, Michael, tell me the truth about what this is really about. He looked at his crying wife, at the lawyer who was already packing his briefcase, at me standing in the light from the window his father had installed 40 years ago. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. We're drowning, Mom. The wedding, Rachel's loans, the credit cards. We owe almost $200,000. We hoped, if you needed help managing things, maybe we could steal from me? Not steal. The words burst out of him like water from a broken dam. Borrow. We'd pay it back, I swear we would. But I can't sleep at night, Mom. I wake up in a panic about the bills. Rachel cries herself to sleep because she's so stressed about money. I thought if we could just access your savings, just enough to get stable. I stared at this man who carried my late husband's features and my own stubborn chin, this person I'd raised to be honest and kind and strong, and felt something break inside my chest that would never quite heal the same way. How much do you think I have, Michael? He glanced at Rachel, then back at me. I don't know, 50,000, maybe 100? Dad was good with money, and you never spent much. The irony was so complete, it took my breath away. Here they were, scheming to steal what they imagined were my modest savings, while sitting on furniture bought with the interest from a fortune that could buy their house 20 times over. I walked to Thomas's old desk and pulled out the envelope he'd left for Michael. I handed it to my son without explanation. What's this? Open it. Michael's hands shook as he unfolded the letter and saw the check. $50,000, exactly what Thomas had calculated would clear their wedding debt. Rachel gasped when she saw the amount. Your father knew, I said quietly. He knew you'd be in debt from the wedding. He knew you'd be stressed and scared and looking for easy solutions. And he knew that giving you this money outright would teach you nothing about managing your finances. Michael looked up from the letter, confusion and hope warring on his face. He also knew that you'd eventually come to me asking for help. What he didn't know was whether you'd ask honestly or whether you'd try to trick me into giving you access to money that isn't yours. I sat down across from him, feeling every one of my 70 years. This check is yours, no strings attached. It will clear your wedding debt and give you a fresh start. But Michael, if you ever try to manipulate me into signing away my independence again, you will be out of my life permanently. Do you understand?" He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "And Rachel," I turned to my daughter-in-law, who was staring at the check like it was written in a foreign language. "You need to understand something. I am not your safety net. I am not your backup plan. I am not your solution to problems you created. I am a human being who deserves your respect, not your schemes." Andrew had finished packing his briefcase and was edging toward the door. "Mrs. Chen Williams, I want you to know that I was only trying to help." "You were trying to earn a fee by facilitating the financial abuse of an elderly woman," I said without looking at him. "Get out of my house." He left without another word. Michael folded the check carefully and put it in his wallet. "Mom, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. I felt so trapped." Debt is a prison you build for yourself, Michael, but manipulation and betrayal are choices. You chose to lie to me, to bring strangers into my home with papers designed to strip away my autonomy. That's not something you can apologize away. Rachel wiped her eyes with a tissue from her purse. "What happens now?" "Now you take that money and you pay off your debts. You learn to live within your means. You build a marriage based on honesty instead of desperation. And you never, ever try to convince me that I'm incompetent again." They left 20 minutes later, Michael carrying the weight of both forgiveness and consequences. Rachel silent with what I hoped was shame. I watched them drive away and then sat on Thomas's porch for a long time, thinking about the difference between love and control, between protection and possession. That evening, I called David Kim and told him what had happened. He listened without interruption, then spoke with the careful tone of a man who'd seen this scenario too many times. "You handled that perfectly, Mrs. Chen Williams, but I want you to be prepared. This might not be over. Financial desperation makes people do stupid things, and sometimes family guilt can be more persuasive than legal intimidation." "What do you recommend?" "Document everything. Keep records of every conversation, every contact, every attempt to pressure you, and consider telling Michael about the trust. Not the full amount, but enough that he understands you're not vulnerable." I thought about that suggestion long into the night. Thomas had been adamant about keeping the full extent of our wealth secret, but circumstances had changed. Maybe it was time for my son to understand that his mother was not the helpless widow he imagined. But first, I needed to make sure that the check Thomas had left would actually solve Michael's problems, rather than just enabling more reckless spending. Money, I'd learned, could be a tool or a weapon, depending on who wielded it and how. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I waited 2 weeks before making the call, 2 weeks to let Michael and Rachel deposit the check, pay off their wedding debt, and hopefully begin to understand what it meant to live without the crushing weight of financial panic. 2 weeks to watch and see if they would honor the boundary I'd set, or if desperation would drive them to try again. They honored it. Michael called twice, both times to check on my health and well-being, with no mention of legal documents or financial planning. Rachel sent a handwritten thank you note, stilted but sincere, acknowledging the gift and apologizing for the misunderstanding about my care needs. On a crisp October morning, I called my son and asked him to come over alone. He arrived within an hour, bringing coffee and the nervous energy of a man who wasn't sure whether he was in trouble or not. I led him to Thomas's workshop in the basement, a space that still smelled of sawdust and machine oil and the patient work of careful hands. "Dad's workshop," Michael said, running his fingers along the workbench where Thomas had spent countless hours creating beauty from raw wood. "I haven't been down here since the funeral." "Sit down, sweetheart." I gestured to the old stool Thomas had used for detail work. There's something I need to show you." I opened the safe and withdrew the trust documents, watching Michael's face as I explained what his father had built over 20 years of careful planning and quiet sacrifice. $47 million, I said, letting the number hang in the air between us. "Your father died leaving me one of the wealthiest widows in North Carolina." Michael stared at the documents like they were written in hieroglyphics. That's impossible. Dad fixed people's porches. You worked at a hardware store. Your father was brilliant with money, Michael. Every dollar we saved, every bonus from a big job, every inheritance from my family, it all went into investments that grew and compounded over decades. We lived below our means not because we were poor, but because your father understood that wealth was about security, not luxury. I showed him the investment statements, the legal protections, the careful structure that made the fortune both accessible and protected. Michael read through page after page, his expression cycling through disbelief, amazement, and something that looked like grief. "You've been rich this whole time," he said finally. "While Rachel and I were panicking about money, while we were scheming to get access to your savings, you could have bought our house 50 times over." "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me?" I sat on the wooden crate Thomas had used for storing sandpaper and looked at my son, really looked at him, searching for the boy who'd learned to use tools at his father's side. Because your father was wise enough to know that knowledge of wealth changes people. Because he wanted you to learn to stand on your own feet before you knew there was a safety net. Because he wanted to see what kind of man you'd become when you thought you had to rely on your own character and effort. Michael winced. "And I failed the test. You stumbled." "There's a difference." I pulled out Thomas's letter to Michael and handed it to him. He read it twice, his hands trembling slightly as he processed his father's words about choice and character, and the difference between help and enabling. "He knew," Michael said. "Dad knew exactly what would happen. He knew it was possible. He hoped it wouldn't be necessary." Michael set the letter down and buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were red but clear. "Mom, I'm so ashamed. When I think about what we tried to do, bringing that lawyer to your house, trying to trick you into signing papers, if I'd known you had this kind of money." "What? You would have asked for more?" "No, I would have, I don't know, been honest about our problems, asked for help instead of trying to take control." I studied his face, searching for the truth behind his words. "And what if I hadn't had this money, Michael? What if I'd been exactly the vulnerable widow you thought I was? Would that have made what you tried to do acceptable?" He was quiet for a long moment, really thinking about the question. "No," he said finally, "it wouldn't have. Taking advantage of someone because you think they're weak, that's not love. That's not protection. That's just taking advantage. And now that you know I'm not weak, not vulnerable, that I have more resources than you could ever need." Michael looked around the workshop, at his father's tools arranged with military precision, at the safe that had held our family's deepest secret for 3 years. "Now I want to be the son Dad thought I could be," he said. "The one who deserves this legacy, not the one who tries to steal it." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of fear and disappointment that had been tightening since the morning Rachel first appeared at my door with her lawyer and her schemes. "There's something else," I said, pulling out one final document. "Your father established a separate fund for you and your children when you have them. It's structured so that you'll receive income from it starting on your 35th birthday, but only if you've demonstrated financial responsibility." Michael looked at the trust document with his name on it, his eyes widening as he processed the numbers. This is more money than I'll ever need. Your father believed that financial security should be earned, not given. The trust will provide you with enough income to live comfortably, but not so much that you never have to work or strive or grow. And if you ever try to manipulate or take advantage of anyone, especially elderly family members, the trust becomes null and void. He really did think of everything, Michael said with something that sounded like wonder. Your father spent his whole life preparing for futures he hoped would never come to pass. That's what love looks like when it's careful and wise and patient. We sat in silence for a few minutes, surrounded by the tools and memories of a man who'd understood that the most important things he could leave behind weren't made of wood or metal, but of character and choice. What happens now? Michael asked. Now you go home to your wife and you build a marriage based on honesty and respect. You learn to manage the money you have instead of scheming for money you don't. You become the kind of man your father believed you could be. And you? I smiled and gestured to the documents spread across Thomas's workbench. I continue to live my life on my own terms, making my own decisions with the security your father built for me. I grow old gracefully, but not helplessly. I remain your mother, but not your responsibility. Michael stood and hugged me, really hugged me, the way he had when he was small and I was the center of his universe. I love you, Mom, and I'm sorry for all of it. I know, sweetheart. I love you too. After he left, I sat in the basement for a long time, surrounded by Thomas's tools and the lingering scent of his aftershave. I thought about the test we'd all endured, Michael and Rachel, me, even Thomas in his way. Some tests reveal character, others build it. This one had done both. I locked the documents back in the safe and climbed the stairs to a house that felt different now, not because the secret was finally shared, but because the sharing had been done on my terms, in my time, as an act of trust rather than surrender. That evening, I called Sarah Martinez in Charlotte and told her about my decision to reveal the trust to Michael. She listened without judgment, then offered what I'd come to value most in my advisors: honest counsel. You took a risk, she said, but it sounds like it was the right one. Your son needed to understand the consequences of his choices, and sometimes the best way to teach someone about wealth is to show them what it looks like when it's managed with wisdom instead of fear. I think Thomas would have approved. I think Thomas would have been proud. Later that night, I sat on the porch Thomas had built and watched the lights of Asheville twinkle in the valley below. A cool breeze carried the scent of wood smoke and autumn leaves, and somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the hour. I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment, from grieving widow to wealthy woman to mother reclaiming her agency. I thought about the armor Thomas had built for me, not just in legal documents and investment accounts, but in the knowledge that I was stronger than anyone imagined, including myself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new choices, new opportunities to demonstrate the character Thomas had spent a lifetime helping me build. But tonight, I was simply a woman sitting on her own porch, protected by love and strengthened by truth, watching the world proceed with the patient certainty of someone who finally understood her place in it. I was no longer hiding behind flowers arranged by others. I was tending my own garden, speaking in my own voice, living according to my own values. The greatest fortune Thomas had left me wasn't measured in dollars, but in the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life brings to your door. And if anyone else came knocking with papers and promises, trying to convince me that I needed their protection, they would find a woman prepared for exactly that battle, armed with the wisdom of experience and the fortress of a love that planned for everything, even its own absence. Epilogue. 6 months later, spring returned to Asheville with the patient persistence of all natural things. The dogwoods bloomed white and pink along my street, and Thomas's roses began their yearly resurrection, pushing green shoots through the dark soil he'd prepared for them so many years ago. I was in the garden transplanting seedlings I'd started on the kitchen windowsill when Michael's car pulled into my driveway. But this time, he wasn't alone. Rachel was with him, and they were both smiling in a way that looked genuine rather than practiced. "Mom," Michael called as he approached the garden gate. "We have news." I set down my trowel and brushed the soil from my hands, noting the changes 6 months had brought to both of them. Michael looked rested for the first time in years, his shoulders less burdened now that he was no longer carrying debt like a millstone. Rachel had traded her designer clothes for jeans and a simple sweater, and her smile reached her eyes in a way I'd never seen before. "Good news, I hope," I said, though their expressions had already given me the answer. "We're pregnant," Rachel said, her hand moving instinctively to her still flat stomach. "Just 8 weeks, but we wanted you to be the first to know." I felt the familiar rush of joy that comes with news of new life, tempered by the wisdom of experience. A baby would change everything for them, just as Michael's birth had changed everything for Thomas and me all those years ago. "Congratulations," I said, hugging them both. "Have you thought about names?" "If it's a boy," Michael said, "we'd like to name him Thomas. After Dad, if that's okay with you." I felt tears spring to my eyes, the good kind, the kind that come when love finds a way to bridge even the deepest wounds. "Your father would be honored." We talked for an hour about due dates and doctor visits and all the small miracles that accompany the creation of new life. But underneath the excitement, I could see the familiar worry lines beginning to form around Michael's eyes, the same ones that had driven him to my door with legal documents and desperate schemes. "How are you feeling about the financial side of things?" I asked gently. "Babies are expensive." Michael and Rachel exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that develops between couples who've weathered storms together. "We're scared," Rachel admitted, "but we're also more honest with each other now. About money, about expectations, about what we can and can't afford. We've been living on a strict budget since we paid off the wedding debt, and we've actually managed to save some money." "Not much," Michael added quickly, "but enough to feel like we're moving in the right direction, instead of drowning." I smiled, remembering my own fears when I discovered I was pregnant with Michael. Thomas and I had been young and broke and terrified, but we'd also been determined to build something stable for our child. That determination had shaped every decision we'd made for the next 40 years. "You know," I said carefully, "your father's trust for you begins generating income when you turn 35. That's still 3 years away, but when the baby comes, there will be distributions available for education and health care." Michael nodded. "We read through all the documents with a financial planner. Dad really did think of everything. But Mom, we want to try to do this on our own first. We want to earn the right to that security, not just inherit it." "That's very wise," I said, and meant it. "But don't let pride prevent you from accepting help when you truly need it. Your father built that trust because he wanted his grandchildren to have opportunities, not because he wanted you to struggle unnecessarily." Over the following months, I watched Michael and Rachel navigate the challenges of pregnancy and impending parenthood with a maturity that had been forged in the crucible of their earlier mistakes. They asked for advice when they needed it, borrowed my car when theirs broke down, but never presumed that my resources were theirs to command. Rachel began coming by on Saturday mornings to help with the garden, and slowly we built a relationship based on mutual respect rather than hidden agendas. She told me about her childhood, about the pressure she'd felt to maintain appearances, even when her family couldn't afford them, about the relief of finally living within her means. "I used to think being rich meant having expensive things," she said one morning as we deadheaded the roses. "Now I think it means being able to sleep at night without worrying about money." "Your father-in-law would have agreed with that," I told her. Thomas James Chen Williams was born on a snowy December morning, exactly 43 years and 10 months after his namesake had been born. I held him when he was 3 hours old, marveling at his tiny fingers and the way he gripped my thumb with surprising strength. "He looks like his grandfather," I whispered to Michael, who was staring at his son with the wonder of all new fathers. "I hope he has Dad's wisdom," Michael said, "and your strength." I thought about the cycles of love and protection that bind families together across generations, about the ways we try to shield our children from the mistakes we've made while hoping they'll have the courage to make better choices when their own tests come. "He'll have his own gifts," I said. "Our job is just to love him and teach him and trust that he'll find his way." 6 months after little Thomas was born, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I established a foundation in Thomas's name, dedicated to financial literacy education for young families. The foundation offers free workshops on budgeting, debt management, and long-term planning, taught by volunteers who understand that money is a tool for building security, not displaying status. Michael and Rachel were among the first to complete the program, not because they needed the education, but because they wanted to help teach others. Watching them work with young couples who were struggling with the same challenges they'd faced, I saw the completion of the circle Thomas had started when he first pressed that brass key into my palm. "You know," Sarah Martinez said during one of our quarterly meetings, "your husband would be amazed by what you've built with his legacy." "I built it with our legacy," I corrected. "The money was his gift, but the wisdom to use it well, that we built together." Now, as I write this on the anniversary of Thomas's death, I'm sitting in the garden he planted, surrounded by the roses he tended and the peace he worked so hard to create. Little Thomas is toddling around the yard, chasing butterflies with the fearless determination of someone who's never doubted his place in the world. Michael and Rachel have bought a modest house 3 streets away, close enough to visit regularly, far enough to maintain their independence. They're expecting their second child in the fall, and this time the worry lines around Michael's eyes are minimal. They've learned to build their life on a foundation of honesty and hard work, with the security of Thomas's trust waiting in the background like a safety net they hope never to need. I think often about the morning Rachel first appeared at my door with her lawyer and her desperate schemes. I think about the woman I was then, grieving, lonely, uncertain of my own strength, and the woman I've become. The money didn't change me, but the knowledge of it did. Not because wealth made me powerful, but because the test of that wealth revealed the power I'd always possessed. I never did sign those papers. They remain in my files as a reminder of the moment I chose to trust my own judgment over other people's promises. The brass key Thomas gave me still opens the safe where our secrets once lived, but now it opens something larger. The understanding that the greatest inheritance we can leave our children isn't money, but the knowledge that they're strong enough to handle whatever life brings to their door. Sometimes strength looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like saying no to people who claim to love you. Sometimes it looks like keeping secrets until the right moment to reveal them arrives. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, strength looks like sitting in a garden you planted with your own hands, watching your grandchild discover the world, knowing that you've protected not just your independence, but your family's future. The roses are blooming again this year, just as Thomas knew they would. Some things endure because they're built to last. Some things endure because love knows how to measure twice and cut once, even when the measurement is the rest of your life. I am Margaret Chen Williams. I am 71 years old. I am wealthy. I am loved, and I am free. And if anyone ever again comes to my door with papers and promises, trying to convince me that I need their protection, they will find a woman who learned long ago that the most powerful word in the English language is no, especially when it's spoken by someone with the courage to mean it. The greatest victory isn't defeating your enemies, it's discovering that you had the strength to protect yourself all along. The end. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more.